This is 2017 AP Chemistry free response question number 4. So it says, a student investigates various dyes using paper chromatography. The student has samples of 3 pure dyes labeled A, B, and C and an unknown sample that contains one of the 3 dyes. The student prepares a chromatography chamber shown above on the left by putting a drop of each dye at the indicated position on the chromatography paper, a polar material, and standing the paper in a non-polar solvent. The developed chromatograms are shown above on the right. Part A says which dye, A, B, or C, is the least polar. Justify your answer in terms of the interactions between the dyes and the solvent or between the dyes and the paper. So the topic covered in this part of the question is polarity and intermolecular forces and understanding how molecules with different polarities would interact. So I'm going to draw out the chromatography strips. We have dye C, dye A, and dye B. And then we have the unknown, which is somewhere over here. So part A is asking us to determine which dye is the least polar and to justify our answer in terms of interactions with the non-polar solvent or with the polar paper. So to answer this question, we need to, as I said before, we need to understand how molecules with different polarities would interact. So we know that the solvent is nonpolar and we know that the paper is polar. We also know that molecules with the same polarity are attracted to each other. So the question is asking us to determine which dye is the least polar, meaning which is more nonpolar. So it's basically asking us which one is more attracted to the nonpolar solvent front. So going back to this drawing, this one, which is dye C, is closest to the nonpolar solvent front. So that would have to be the least polar dye. So to write out the entire answer, dye C is the least polar. Because it is closest to the non-polar solvent front and non-polar molecules attract non-polar molecules. So going to the scoring key to see how many points you'd get for that answer. You get 1 point for the correct choice and reference to the chromatogram. So they give the example, dye C is least polar because it moved the farthest. Let's go back to my answer. I said dye C is the least polar because it is closest to the non-polar solvent front. I think that gets a point. That's plus 1. And then you'd get another point for a correct description of the dye-solvent interaction or the dye-paper interaction. So the examples they give are nonpolar dyes are more strongly attracted to the nonpolar solvent and or nonpolar dyes are least strongly retained by the polar paper. So going back to this, nonpolar molecules attract nonpolar molecules. That is another point. Yay. So then for part B, it says, which dye is present in the unknown sample? Justify your answer. So, going back to the diagram they give us. This question deals with understanding how chromatography works. I don't think it's a topic. I think it's more of like a skill, understanding how different experiments work. So, we have the unknown sample positioned halfway between the solvent front and the origin. So in order to figure out which dye is present in the unknown sample, we need to compare that with the positioning of dye A, B, and C. So with that being said, I think the dye present in the unknown sample would have to be dye A, because it is also positioned halfway between the origin and the solvent front. To write that out. Dye A is present in the unknown. Both both samples are positioned. That says positioned halfway between the origin and the solvent front. So let's check the answer key. It says dye 8 is present in the unknown sample. We'd get 1 point for the correct choice. Oof. Wait. Okay. +1. And then you get another point for valid justification, which is either the unknown sample moves to a position that is midway between the origin and the solvent front, and so does dye A, which is basically what I said, positioned halfway between origin and solvent front. That is another point. The second justification that would give you a point is that dye A has a retention factor that is close to 0.5 on the chromatogram with the 3 dyes, and the unknown also has a retention factor close to 0.5. And retention factor is basically a calculation done with chromatography where you calculate the distance traveled by the dye over the distance traveled by the distance moved by the solvent. And it's basically saying the same thing because its retention factor is 0.50. That means it's positioned halfway. So, yeah. This is the end of this question.